So welcome everybody to tonight's session on REFramework, Queues, Configuration and Creating with the States Developer Series. This is part 3 of 4. And if you go to the next slide.
Sure.
I'm Diana Gray. I'm the Community Marketing Manager for UiPath. And this is Chris Bolin, the Senior Analyst for Mary Kay. He's also one of our MVPs. So we're proud to have him here tonight. And if you go to the next slide. For those of you who haven't joined before, we started a series of developer meetings. I'll go into this a little bit further in the slide deck, but these are America Developer Community Sessions. They're managed by MVPs for developers. The MVPs reside in Canada, Latin America, and USA. You're encouraged to network with the MVPs and share your LinkedIn in the chat box because we really want to get to know you. These sessions are for you. They're really based on developer topics so that you have an opportunity to share, ask questions, let us know if you're having any problems. Please use the chat to place all your questions. And if you can, keep yourself on mute unless you have a question that you want to ask Chris tonight. And then I'll be putting some stuff on the next session in the chat box, as well as the link to next week's session. But then also I do want you to know that this session tonight will be recorded and will be available tomorrow. So if you go to the next session, so we just have one more session in this series, and that's on October 10th. So we really hope you'll join us for that as well. Chris will be talking about debugging, workflow, analyzer, and validation. And if you go to the next slide, I also want you to make you aware of our next developer series, which is going to be on UiPath apps. So this will be part of your slide deck that you can review tomorrow. But basically that starts on the day after this one ends. It's on October 4th. So on Tuesday nights for 4 weeks at 5 o'clock Eastern. So with that, Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So we are talking tonight about config queues and code segments. And so we're going to start and talk about code segments and libraries before we get into configs. All right, so we've been talking about dispatcher performer, whether you call it a producer consumer or dispatcher performer. But basically, if we draw back a little bit, we talk about how we build our automations. We want to use as much as what we call reusable code as we possibly can. I'll give you an example. So we at Mary Kay, we have about 72 automations that simply through the week of close, which is this week, obviously, it goes into our accounting system and it performs a number of functions. It closes business units, it posts journals, it validates journals, it runs reports and queries and sends them to the appropriate people, things like that. And all of those are primarily run in what we talked about last week was a linear REFramework, where we either inactivate that transaction, get transaction data step, or we take it out completely. It becomes a linear automation because all these 70 plus automations do, it clicks through the system. We call them click-throughs at Mary Kay. And in each of one of these, for example, the bots log in to the accounting system in the same fashion every single time. It may be a different Active Directory credentials. Some of the bots use, in some systems we have, the bots all share the same credentials, depending on the system and how your architecture and your systems admins team set those up. So what we do is we build one login code segment. And we put that into each of those. We don't rebuild it 70 times. We copy and we paste it. We do that at Mary Kay. We do that in what we call a common folder. And we'll get in that in a minute. And then, or you can do that in a library. So a code segment is just that snippet of code. We want to avoid building what we call an end-to-end automation. We want to break that end-to-end automation up in code segments. Code segments that you can then reuse in other automations. So you're not redeveloping, reinventing the wheel every single time you sit down and do a business process, because you will find very often that many of the business processes that you'll be working with are either have upline or downline dependencies, are very similar for different groups. When we talk about email management, when we talk about data sets, when we talk about reconciliations for different banks. I know all companies use more than one bank. All of those segments become very similar in your business process. So you're able to really capitalize on cannibalizing code that you've built before already. You may have to tweak it a little bit, but reuse that code. So your automations, instead of taking 3 to 4 weeks to develop, take a week to 10 days. Right now in R, we have so much reusable code because we have over 300 automations at Mary Kay, that an automation that a business brings to us, unless it's a new process or a new automation, we've had some of those where we actually have to build from the ground up. An automation takes me maybe a week to build, sometimes less, depending on the complexity of the automation, simply because I'm able to draw on that code. In that same vein, for example, our accounting system is going through an upgrade. It's a cloud-based system. We really have no say in, hey, we don't want to upgrade. They're going to upgrade and they're going to sunset the old system we were on. And this new system is dynamically different. The UI is dynamically different. The selectors are dynamically different. The placement of the pages that the bot goes to. So in reality, we have to recode over 70 automations just for that close piece. At Mary Kay, we have other things that go into that accounting system that are not close related, that run throughout the month. So, but using that reusable code, we're able to change that one piece of code and copy and paste it into all of those other automations without having to touch every automation and redo every piece of code in every automation. So it's very important because systems upgrade. And now that we all have a cloud-first strategy, and a lot of things aren't going to be on-prem because we want to discontinue data centers and we want to save that infrastructure cost, having reusable code is key to your success as a developer. And your build to go to market is that time span is key to you. Ease of maintenance, it's key. Testing, it's key. So you make sure when you sit down to plan your process design document or project plan, that you think about in your head what the bot will do when. Have I built this before? If I have, do I need to, can I reuse it and just tweak it a little bit, or can I reuse it cleanly? Okay, reusable code. Now these code segments, I do these in 2 different ways. And I'm going to jump down here to this guy. So I build in an accounting environment. Okay, and so we have to deal with those monsters called accounting controls. And so I have to be very careful on how I do my code segments and where I store those code segments. So there's 2 ways I do it. You can create a library, and I'll show you how to create a library really quickly. Or you can do what we do, or a combination of both, because we do have a combination of both, where we create a folder in this structure. If we go up here, we click on this folder on your REFramework screen. I think I have one open here. Yes, I do. So if we go over here to project, can you see that, Diane? Can you see a studio screen? Or are you still seeing the PowerPoint?
No, I see the screen.
Okay, thank you. Okay, if you would click here to your File Explorer, and it's going to open your file. What we typically do at Mary Kay is we create a new folder and we call it a common folder. Okay. And in this common folder, I'm going to go through and I'm going to put any reusable code from other automations that I want to put in here. And you say to me, well, Chris, why don't you create a library? And if you don't know a library, what is, I'll explain it to you. A library, if I put that code in a library, it becomes an activity. Okay. If I have to tweak that code at all, I'm tweaking that library item, and that tweaks that library item for every other automation that's using that library code. Okay. Secondly, we have to, in thinking about controls, and audit controls and limiting access to certain people that have certain rights to see certain things. So when I go in, when we automate automations in our payroll division, I'm the only one that can see that payroll stuff. None of the other people that build automations within my COE are authorized to see that those payroll items. I can lock out. Now this sits in this folder structure here will sit within my folder that's tied to my Azure DevOps branch or my source control branch. I can restrict access to this common folder or this entire demo or this entire automation by controlling it through my file explorer. I can grant access, I can restrict access. And I can do that same thing whether I'm in my Azure DevOps folder, branch folders, or whether I'm sitting on a network shared. You can control that. You would need, obviously, the ability to set Active Directory credentials and control that, or if I don't know if you go through some sort of information security division at your department. But when you're working with a library, however, and that library sits in your tenant, because if you're using Orchestrator, that's where your library is going to go, is in your tenant. Other people can use that library activity, right? So it's very difficult to restrict that when you have other people in your tenant on Orchestrator. So you have to be very cautious about, do I want to create this as a library reasonable code segment, or do I want to create this as a copy paste code segment? Okay, so all of our code segments are, like I said, like the DevOps branch, we only have certain people that can get to certain folders, and I control all of that. We do the same thing with our shared drive, where our bots all have their own shared drive, and any inputs and outputs go directly into their shared drive. They don't go into a download folder. They don't go into a general drive that everybody can see. They don't go into our C drive, our local disk drive. They all go into a bot shared drive, which is this guy right here. And that is restricted. Access to that is restricted to myself. I have access to all of them, but there's certain people that only have access to certain folders within that shared drive, depending on what their ability to see what information there is. So I hope I'm not confusing anybody. If I am, yell at me. All right, so back to this guy. That's my common folder. And in my common folder, I'm just going to throw in, and I'll show you an example of what we have for a common folder. You can see in any single one of my common folders, I have reusable code that I've used somewhere else. Okay. And the only reason I put these in this common folder, like you see my login browser, I put these in the common folder simply because not everybody can use that login browser, because then you're getting into our accounting system. Okay. And in this particular accounting system, our bots use a shared login. Each bot uses the same login. Okay. So that's why we use a common folder, because we're able to gain more control over access. In a library, if you have a code segment that's really, you're using it all the time, it doesn't have any security problems, you don't have any security issues with it, you can put it in the Orchestrator, anybody can use it. We would create that reusable code in what we call the library. You would click here. You would name your library. We'll just name this test library. Now, this path is going to, if you're using a source control, this path is going to have to point to that folder structure that supports your source control. Okay, that probably will not be in your user documents UiPath folder. It will probably be where you store your automations that you then upload into Orchestrator, and you manage the changes to those automations through your source control folder when you go in and change your source control, your automations for maintenance. And you would just hit create. And this is going to create a library item in my UiPath folder, but that's fine. Okay. And then you would start just building your library just like you would code. So let's add an activity. Let's just throw in an assign. Well, come on, guys. That's not. Don't you love it when you get into a groove and it's not letting you do it? Let's do new. Let's do a new sequence. There we go. Let's create a new sequence there in my folder. Let's just throw in let's say I'm doing a for each data loop. Okay. Once I save that and I publish it, it's going to publish to my orchestrator. Okay. And it's going to become available as an activity. So let's say we publish this, and I'm not going to go through the publishing because I don't want to publish this blank to my orchestrator. So let's say when we're now going into an automation, if we go to settings and we find that library we created, let's say we're finding test library. And again, this is going to have to be wherever you stored that original library code you made, not the published to orchestrator piece, but that code that you made that you're going to maintain in that library should be in your source control folder. You might want to open up create a new folder in your source control folder called libraries or library. You would find that source control folder, you would add it, and your library will show up down here. Okay. And then when you go into your activities, you can pull in your library here. Now, keep in mind, once this is created and stored as a library of reusable code, you cannot change that once you pull it into your automation. That library is that library. Okay. That is the source, that reusable code in your library. The only place you can change that is in your library. Okay. You would have to go back to your library folder, make your maintenance or changes to that library item, and then resave it and publish it. Keep in mind, however, when you save that library, if you've saved changes to that library that are unique to this automation, and you're using that same library code in a different automation, you've altered the other automations that you use that library code in. Okay. So in my personal opinion, and now you can do what you feel is best, or what your organization may have some guidelines around this. I prefer to use the common folder. I have more control over the common folder. I have more ability to manipulate the common folder without going through source control, changing my libraries, wondering where else someone else may have used that, and I've just destroyed their automation. I find it much easier to use a common folder. So this is our preferred way of doing it at Mary Kay. We do this way globally. We have very few library items. Okay. We globally use a common folder. Okay. All right. Code segments and libraries. Let's look at some configuration files. Now, if you're on the version I'm on one of the older versions of UiPath, because we don't upgrade to 2022 until I think it's May or June of next year is when we start that process, because we can't do it while we're doing the accounting system upgrade, which is taking a year. Okay. That's how involved it is. So I'm on one or either of these will look familiar to you. This is a config file of what I'm used to seeing right now on my current version. My orchestrator queue name, log business process name, my constants, my assets. So let's talk about assets. If you're managing your assets in Orchestrator, that means an asset being a URL address, an asset being a credential asset, username and a password. If you're an email address, something along that lines. If you're managing those in Orchestrator, you do not have to do dual maintenance and dual management and have an assets tab populated, because you're going to call within your code to get the Orchestrator assets. So if your assets are an Orchestrator, the bot's going to pull them from Orchestrator. You do not need to do an asset tab. If you are not managing your assets through Orchestrator, you will need to do an asset tab. Okay. Don't let this confuse you. Any of the developers are going to tell you don't need to manage it in both places. Constants tab. Now, again, this is on a config file that I see every day. You may see a different one. Max retry number. That's when you're using your queues and they have transactions in your queues and you're set a retry number. Let's say you want before the bot fails a queue item, you want it to retry 2 or 3 times. That's going to be established in your queue within Orchestrator. The queue is always going to override this number. Okay. You could put 2 here and have 3 in Orchestrator, and it's going to retry 3. Okay. It will always, Orchestrator always overrides this. This we talked about last week. This is very important, or last time we met 2 weeks ago. Where do we want, when our bot takes a screenshot on an error or something along that lines, or where we program in a screenshot, where do we want those screenshots saved? You could do a relative path or an absolute path. A full path is an absolute path. That's where you're going and you're doing the full address to your share drive or wherever you're saying it. If you do a relative path and you are using a source control on Azure DevOps, something along that line, your relative path is going to get wrapped up in that source control and you won't be able to see your screenshots. Okay. Be very difficult for you. What we typically do is we will put, and we call all these exception screenshots. You can see in my folder, everybody has an exception screenshots file. Now this is stored in our bot folder, okay, where access is restricted and limited. And even some developers, as I said, only have access to certain automations. We would just simply start typing in here right before that guy, and we would just put our absolute address. If I can hit the right buttons here, guys, sorry. And we would go down to where I hit. I'm having some problems with my thing today. Excuse me for a minute, guys. We would go down to where we get to that exception screenshots folder, okay? So that when we create our screenshots, or when the bot creates a screenshot, you can even add what automation number it was for, what step in that automation number it was for. You can add that within your code, take your screenshot. Into the address, into that, how you're doing your screenshot. This is where your screenshots will go. Wherever you put here is where your screenshots will go. Now, don't do as my intern accidentally did one year. And he put this guy over here. So none of the bots that he was working on were saving screenshots, and we couldn't figure out why until we realized he had put this in the wrong place, because his file actually opened up like this. So he thought, because of his resolution, he thought he was putting it in the right place. He was not. It has to go in your value file, okay? This kind of stuff we don't really need to worry about. It's going to be these 2 primaries that you want to deal with. If you're using Orchestrator, you can ignore this guy, but this guy should always be populated with an absolute address. If you're using source control, make sure you put an absolute address, okay? Settings. Dictionary this is a dictionary file, just like you and I would use if you're as old as I am. Before they even had computers in school, we would look up our term theme items in the card file in the library, and we would use the dictionary. Every classroom had a set of dictionaries. In fact, your English teacher made you have a dictionary every time you came to class. Dictionaries, this is the same thing. This is the word you're looking up. This is the knowledge you're getting, okay? The bot's reading this column, and this is the column you're going to reference in your code, and the bot's getting the information from this column, okay? This is just a description for you. The bot does not read this column, okay? You can put whatever you want here that makes this dictionary more intuitive to you. And we fill out this every time we do a config file. We're going to put what this is for, where in the automation it's used, because you want your config file to be as descriptive as possible. Because if you win the lottery and you win the 380 million that's in Texas right now, you're probably not coming to work tomorrow. I'm not. If I win the lottery, and I'm sure I can speak for Diana, she probably won't either. So you want whoever's going to take this code over to know where in the process is this guy used? Where in the process is he not, is this guy used? What does this guy do? So again, this is the word you're looking up. This is the knowledge you're getting. So when you create a dictionary item, I'm going to take this guy out. Let's just do let's just say we're creating an in-config dictionary item. It's an in because we're bringing it in as a dictionary. We're going to browse for types. We're going to look for dictionary. And we're going to use this guy in the Microsoft Core Library. I'm going to do key value is going to be my string. That's what I'm reading from my dictionary. And this guy's going to be an object because that's the information the bot's getting in its brain out of your dictionary. Okay. And I'm sure we're all familiar with dictionaries because I'm sure everybody's using a config file according to UiPath best practices, especially if you're using REFrameworks, you have to use a config file. New config file, and I pulled this from Larry on my laptop because he's on the new version. This is what Larry sees when I build an automation for any time I do demos or teach students and things like this. This is what they are using in the community. So this, or the enterprise edition that they have installed in the school, the school buildings. So this is what I use to teach them on Larry. So you'll see your assets are different, it's the same. Okay. Don't need to, again, you don't need to manage assets if you're managing your assets in Orchestrator. Your constants here are a little bit different. You have your max retry number. Here, if you remember, were with us last week, we talked about this max consecutive systems exceptions. And unfortunately, I can maybe show this to you. I don't think the new version is I don't think Larry's, what he sent me today is going to open up on my version, but we'll try. Max consecutive systems exceptions simply means if you set this to 2, the bot's going to retry a system exception twice before it stops the automation, before it kills your automation, because you've only gone up to 2 times. So remember, it's going to, the first time is 0, second time is 1, third time is 2. So you got 3 tries. Okay. Max system exceptions. You have your exception screenshots path again, which should be filled in if you're using source control. Then you have this guy down here, should mark job as faulted. This is going to default in your new configuration file to false. If you mark it as true, and an error happens in your init state, the job's going to fault. It's going to be marked as faulted in your Orchestrator logs. Okay. Some people are kind of weird. They only want to see green in their Orchestrator. They only want to see successes, but you really can't tell if you have a problem with your automation unless you have a fault that then notifies you and you can see what that fault was. And you've really at that point, if you're having everything default to false, then you're never going to find those errors. Your automation is just going to finish successfully because it did. You have it defaulted to false. Okay. So we always change this to true when we're working with students or when I'm doing demos, so we can see where the faults happen, so we can track that during our log messaging. Okay. Your settings file is going to be the same, except now we have this thing called Orchestrator Queue folder. Now, this is, you leave this blank if you're using the classic view of Studio, the classic view of Orchestrator. You're not using the modern folder structure. The modern folder structure is not available on the version I have, but it is on the newer versions. And so if you're using the modern folder structure, this is where you would designate your folder name. I would leave this blank, and I don't really use the modern folder structure when I'm teaching. It gets a little too complicated for the students. So we typically just ignore this, but your organization may be using the modern folder structure. This is where you would put that folder name. And then the rest is what you've already seen, okay? And again, it's the same thing, a dictionary and knowledge. And this is where you're going to describe everything possible about that item that you think needs to be known by whoever's going to take this over from you when you win the lottery, okay? Your config file is going to be set up in your REFramework. In this little block here, now on mine it is at least in the version I have. It's going to be right in here in your initial all settings. This is where your bot's reading your config file, okay? You don't need to change anything in this, okay? You shouldn't have to change anything in this initialization, initial all settings folder, okay? Now, let's see if I can show you what the new one looks like. And it may not open correctly, but let's give it a shot. What Larry sent me today. Since I'm on an older version of my server here, we may not be able to see it, but let's try. So I can show you the difference in that initialization state that handles that max retry number. And it's just a simple if statement. And by the way, if you're on the old version of REFramework and you want to know, because REFramework did change when we moved to the 2021, is it 2021-10.6, if I'm not mistaken, it did not change from that version to the 2022. But it did change to that first version. Let's see if we can go into main and see if we can see it. You can see I'm going to have problems opening this because of my versioning, but I should not have problems with an if statement, and I don't. This is how your maximum retry number, your system, maximum consecutive system exceptions is handled. It's handled through this if statement here, and it's going to throw a consecutive system exceptions, and it's going to end your automation. Your automation is going to go. It's going to go to the end state and you're going to be done. Okay. That's where that's handled in this new REFramework. I can't show you much else because you can see, because of my versioning, I'm not going to be able to see much else. But I think one of the other changes you're going to find, I think we can see it here. Or not. No, we're not going to be able to see it on mine. Sorry, guys. Okay. Because of my versioning. All right. So that's where that's handled. It's all in your initialization step. And remember the maximum, this new entry for max consecutive systems exceptions. I think it's this guy. No, it's this guy. This is handled in your initialization state. That means if you're in your process state and the organization or your vendor or the people who are hosting your cloud instance change that application over a Sunday night or a weekend and wasn't on the release notes and you didn't know about it, your automation is going to try that process, that system exception. It's going to try it twice or 3 times because this is the first time. It's going to run it once, then it's going to retry it. If we have set this to 2, it's going to run it once, going to run it again, run it again. If it gets those data, those exceptions, then it's going to stop. But it's all going to be happening in the initialization state. Because if you remember in your REFramework, this system exception bar goes back to your initialization state. So if you have something bad happen here with your application that you're trying to interact with, it's going to try and retry that. It's going to close it. It's going to kill everything. And it's going to try and start over. If you're working with a transaction, it's going to show as a retry in your Orchestrator Queues. And it's going to go back and try this over again. So this is where that if statement is in this initialization state. If it meets that threshold of what you set the default to in your config, and you set that in your config, you don't set that in your orchestrator, it's going to go over here to your end process. It's going to stop your automation. If you don't have faulted set to true, that show as a faulted set to true, you're not going to know. Okay. You want to set it to true so you know something happened with this automation. Otherwise, the business is going to come and say, we turned in our work, we never got the output, and you had no idea because you haven't gotten any fault notices from your orchestrator. Hope that makes sense. All right. So we talked about a common folder. We talked about libraries. Again, I prefer common. Maybe your preference is libraries. Maybe your company has a preference for libraries. We generally, like I said, use common. We talked about your configuration file. Your configuration file is going to be over here in your automation, in your project under data. Okay. You'll notice that in your REFramework, also in this data file, you have inputs, outputs, and temps. An input would be any files you have coming into the bot. Output would have any files that you're coming out of that process. And temp would be any files that you are temporarily holding in a certain place while the bot processes them. I don't use these folder structures because we store this kind of input, output, temp in our bot's shared drive, okay? Because we have to archive for audit purposes. So we have a whole separate archive folder that the bot drops all of its audit archives into, that our internal audit group then reviews. So I don't use these folder structures. We have to do a different folder structure within ours because of our internal audit rules, because of some of our system restrictions, accounting controls, and because of some EY rules, Ernst & Young outside audit rules. So we don't use this, but this is here available for you. If you do not, again, if you're going to wrap this guy up in source control, you're going to lose the ability to see these when your bot's running. So that's why we stick ours out somewhere else for the audit and for us to evaluate. Okay, but your config file's right there. And when it comes out of your initialization state, it's coming out. I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong one. It's coming out of this guy as a config. Okay. Your out config becomes your config. Anywhere else you're going to use that guy in your process. It's going to be an in config equals config. Okay. So wherever you use it again within your automation, your out config becomes in config simply by assigning your arguments. All right. All right. Let's move on to transactions and queues. I unfortunately cannot show you my orchestrator because it would get me fired, and I want to retire in 10 years. And I tell Diane my retirement plans all the time. Okay, transaction queues, data stored uniformly. Yes, it is. And that's the beauty of using a dispatch performer process. If you want to call it a producer consumer, that's fine with me. Multiple bots can use the same queue, can process the same queue at the same time. However, some caveats, and the reason it can do is because each of these queue items is going to have the same. Now, each of these queue items is going to have the same categories. Now, you may not have an accounting date on one invoice, but you still have an accounting date. It's just, it'll just say null, okay? And you would account for that null in your code. Back to the caveats. Okay, so if your bots are sharing a shared login, shared credentials into an application, and you want, and this particular invoice one is high volume. We can get 1,200 invoices a night. Sometimes we'll get 2,000 invoices, sometimes less. And so we do have multiple bots processing these at the same time. And they do share a shared login. If you do, you have to make sure that your architecture or systems team sets up that login where you can have multiple logins using the same credentials at the same time in the same system. Okay. Some systems will not let you do that. We have one system where we can only log in with one credential at one time. In our accounting system, we can have 10 people logging in with the same credentials at the same time doing the same thing. Okay. So you want to make sure that if you're going to have multiple bots processing the same queue, you want to make sure you have that set up correctly in that application with your support teams. Okay. If your bots are logging in with their own Active Directory credentials, in our organization, each bot has its own server home, its own email address, its own username and password, its own Active Directory credentials. And they're all stored in Orchestrator as assets. If those bots are logging into that application using their own Active Directory credentials, they can do the same thing with the same file. So a bot's going to get this one. The next bot's going to go get the next one. You may have three. If you have 3 or 4 bots processing the same queue, you may have 4 items that are in process at the same time. And once one's done, the bot will go get another one. Okay. And you can have that until the queue empties, or you can assign certain bots to process that queue while other bots are doing other things. Okay. So on your higher transaction volume queues, it's always a good idea to set those up where you can have multiple bots process those. Otherwise, guys, you're having one bot process one queue. And if you have 1,000 items in that queue and each item takes a minute, you're tying up a bot for 1,000 minutes. If you think about that, that's a long time. Or 30 seconds, you're tying up that bot for that long length of time where you're stuck. And if you have a busy day, like during close week or the end of the year, you really want the flexibility in your bots to be able to manage to work multiple bots in those high transaction queues. So you can have it reassigned. Now, in your queues also, when you set your queues up in Orchestrator, you can set them up. Well, when a queue loads and something's in the queue, then the queue sets off a bot to come clean it out. And you can set those queues up to say, okay, I want to load every time one transaction shows up, I want it to be processed. You can have those queues set up so that once a transaction shows up, a bot gets assigned to process that queue. Or you can have a queue set up to say, okay, I don't want a bot to process this queue because it's a lower priority queue item until there are 25 items in this queue. On that 25th item, orchestrators can take a bot and have it start processing those. Okay. So they're called queue triggers, and you would set those up when you set up your initial queues. We don't set up our own queues in my organization. Our system admins set up our queues. The only queues I have control over in my organization are going to be my non-prod queues, my test queues. Once I put something into production and it uses a queue, our system admins set those up based on my specifications. So to have those changed, now I know in my organization, we manufacture a product that people put on their faces, lotions, hand stuff. And so we're governed by the FDA. So whenever we want to change something that is a system change, regardless if it's RPA or anything, we have to go through a whole change control process and document that process for government regulators. Okay. So if you set up your queues initially a certain way and you want to change those, if you have the ability to change those, certainly change those. Otherwise, you may have to go through some rigmarole. So be careful how you want your queues set up. Because remember, if you're in a busy end of the year month and you've set up a queue to say, okay, once 25 are in here and you've got that queue set up to be multiple bots working that queue, once 25 are in here and those 25 items take 2 minutes, you're talking 2 bots being tied up for that length of time because you have 2 bots assigned to work that queue, okay, on how you set your queue up. So you want to make sure that when you start setting queues up and you start to, or yourself or having a team set them up, you want to make sure that your queues are set up efficiently. If you've ever talked with anybody at Pepsi, Pepsi has 5 orchestrator instances, and they have one person that his whole job is to manage Orchestrator. And so he's the one that's going in there, setting the queues up. And if he needs to change queues, he has the ability to do that. Nobody else does. So your organization may be set up a little bit different. Ours is a little bit more restrictive. We're a private corporation. And so the Mary Kay family is a little bit more restrictive. Plus we have the FDA controls that we have to worry about. Okay. And we talked about building in code segments. When we build in code segments, all I'm really talking about here, guys, is if I'm in my process state, and I think we've gone over this before, but I'll just repeat it real quick. If I want to build, and I don't build in sequences, I build in flowcharts, or I build in state machines. I'm going to do a new state machine or a new flowchart. I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to point it at this guy's common folder, select my folder, and create. Okay. Now my flowchart opens up, but in my process queue, it's still not there. So I just need to drag it from my common folder over to my process queue. I get that out of there if it's a placeholder. And I can start building in my flowchart here. And it's now part of my automation. To me, that's just so simple. Instead of going up here and adding the packages, adding the library, perhaps needing to create a new library item just for this single automation. I just find it a lot faster and more efficient in my end. And now this is just how we do it here, to create a common folder, and everything that I create in that code is in common folder. Now, if I went out here and I copied something from another automation and I put it in this common folder here, I just right click, copied and pasted into here. And I pasted that into there. Then all I have to do is hit this refresh button, and that new segment that I copied and pasted will show up over here, and I can drag it into my process, my initialization, my end state, wherever it is. Or if I've created a new state somewhere in here and I want to put it in a new state I've created it somewhere in here, I can just drag it in there and it's there, instead of going through a library process. My preference may not be yours. It may not be something that's allowed by your company. Okay. Drag it in, and then you just tie out your arguments. Remember, every time you build something in here, I'm going to have to create arguments. And in each one of these segments, you're going to have to bring your config file in. So the first thing you're going to create in your argument is an in-config. No, that's not the one I wanted. Sorry, guys, I went to the wrong one. On my flow chart. You have to, first you're going to have to create an in-config, your dictionary, to bring it into this segment, because that in-config is now going to be equal to, since you have an in-config here, and this process, your in-config is brought into this process as a config, and you're building within this process container, your in-config that you create here is now going to be equal to the process in-config, not config. In-config now equals in-config. Now, if you don't want that confusion, take this guy out and just start putting your code segments in here, and then in-config is equal to config each time. Okay. That makes sense, because you do not have to use this process flow chart, not that one, this one. You do not have to use this. You can take this out and you can put your own segments in here. Here's a default to make it easier for you. Okay. Remember, REFramework is a template. Templates can be changed. All right. Leave these guys, business rule and system exception. Leave those guys where they're at. And now in your instance of Studio, you may see a set transaction status up under this try right here. And you may see a set transaction status right here, and another one right here. In the older versions of the REFramework, the set transactions in finally. It's in the newer versions, it's no longer here. It's up here in this process, is up here. And one more thing, in your newer REFramework, your process here is now part of your framework folder here. All right, I think I've talked myself out. A lot of information. Any questions? Or was that easy stuff?
Chris, I have a question.
Sure.
It's regarding the queues. Can you go back to slide number 10? The question is, so if we create a queue, say, suppose the the invoice number or the voucher number are there on the queue. But if I have to modify as part of the process, if I have to modify that voucher number, UiPath doesn't allow modifying the queue data, right? Like say, it's not the voucher number might not be a proper example. Say, suppose as part of my process, I'm creating an account and also I'm adding some funds onto the account. So when I'm like I'm just comparing with the Blue Prism. So usually in case of Blue Prism, like it's a two-step process, creating the account and adding the funds. But when processing the application, when processing that queue item, suppose bot was successful adding the account and failed at the account processing level, usually the way we do was say account created to yes after the account creation step, and then during the during processing step, if it is failed, then what we do is as part of the process, we are going to check whether the account created yes or no, because it's already created as part of the first processing. It directly goes to the second processing. So that is possible because on queue level, we can modify the information in between, while processing the queue. So, but in case of UiPath, if once the queue data is added, we cannot able to modify the queue data. That's a kind of behavior that I observed. Like only the information that we can modify is output data. Like if we want to add any output data, that we can add it during the set transaction status, but we cannot modify anything of the queue data. Is this a correct understanding?
You are correct. Once you've loaded your queue item, if you're using what we call at Mary Kay, at least queue builds, to my knowledge, I'm going to say someone may prove me wrong, or someone may say, Chris, you're totally off base on that. To my knowledge, once you've loaded that queue item, and we do our queue builds or through that linear process, what we call them queue builds or dispatchers. Once you've loaded that information in that queue remains the same for every transaction. So in your instance, where you're wanting to modify the queue data, I don't think you can do that in UiPath. Correct. I think you would have to do that somewhere in your code, in your process section, or in your get transaction data. If during your get transaction data, you want to add some new data using some code in that data, so it goes down into the process transaction with that extra data, you could do that there. But to my understanding in UiPath, you cannot modify the queue item once that queue item is loaded.
Okay. And the other question that I have is, even the analytics data we can add during the set transaction status, but what is the purpose of this analytics data? Is it only for the insights, UiPath insights or some analytics, or is there any other use for this analytics data?
For the analytics data,
yeah,
it depends on what your company wants to track. So in Mary Kay, for example, you have this default, and I can't show you my Orchestrator, unfortunately. You have that default analytics page, that home page that gives you some basic analytics data. We don't use that. We have different means. So when we process, when we get 1,200 items one night for invoices, we will during our queue build, during our dispatcher process, we record those analytics and that those numbers and things like that in separate worksheets, in a separate worksheet that we have, that we then feed into Tableau, because I do Tableau too. So our bots actually populate worksheets with that metrics data. And we can go in, remember Orchestrator's web-based. You can go in and get the average time it's taking for that automation to run, the number of automations you ran, things like that. And you can feed that into some outside source. So we don't use, I think it's Kibana. I'm not sure what UiPath integrates with, but we take our data out and it flows into Tableau. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Chris. Can I ask my question? It is Naresh done.
Yes.
Hi, Chris. First of all, thanks for this very informative session on REFramework. This is the third session. I gained a lot from this session.
Okay.
I just have a quick question. I joined a little late today, and you're showing a common folder as compared to the library.
Mhm.
So I just want to understand, how common folder replaces the library usage. If I have to build it
It doesn't
again.
increase it replaces my library usage. Okay.
Yeah.
So if you remember and if you worked here, I'll kind of recap what I was saying.
Yeah.
With the library, you're actually with the library, you're creating an activity, okay, that you're going to have to bring into your automation. Now, if you need to change that library item, you're going to have to change it within the library. And if you have any other automations that are using that library item, it's going to change those automations, right? In our organization, since we're dealing with financial controls, because I build for a very large financial piece of our organization, whether it be audit, tax, whatever it might be, import, export, all those. When we build, we use a common folder because I can copy and paste reusable code from other automations into my common folder. And if I need to tweak it for this particular automation, 85% of my code may already be built. I just need to tweak 15% of that. That saves me from creating yet another library item. And I'm able to create common copy and paste. Also, I'm able to restrict access to certain automations. Like the example I gave is I build automations for our payroll team. Not everybody besides the payroll team and myself has the authorization to see what that bot brings in, outputs, what it logs into, what it deals with within its code. So we're able, by using common folders, we can restrict access to any type of folder in a shared drive or a common folder, so people cannot access when they don't have the rights to access. It's a way of us fulfilling with the bot and maintaining accounting controls. If you think about the finance industry or the financial part of your organization before RPA, you had certain people that had certain rights to do certain things, and other people did not have the same rights. And you may log into a system and see something totally different than another person could see because of the variation of rights and accounting controls. So when we bring in RPA and we start automating all this, and we're doing automation for the entire process, we have to be able to control that somehow. And we find it became easier to control that using a common folder than it is using a library. Because libraries, again, are published to Orchestrator, and anybody in your tenant can use that library item. So if you have library items in your tenant that have to deal with payroll, either you have to set up a different payroll tenant that they don't have access to, because it's very hard to restrict access to the libraries with your tenant, because you're just pulling in an activity into your automation. Now you can't change it, but you're pulling it into your automation, but you're losing some control there and some audit controls. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, thanks. I just would like to know, what is the real difference?
It depends on your organization. Some organizations say they want all reusable code in libraries, and you have these extensive libraries that you're spending a lot of time maintaining libraries, whereas you could just do a common folder, copy and paste into each automation, hit your little refresh button here, and then if you have to do any tweaks, you're tweaking it within this automation. You're not changing the other automations that you used. In a library, you stand a chance of changing another automation that, if you have multiple developers in your COE, they may have used that library and you may not know about it. Because although we all want to do a perfect PDD, a process design document, and we want our configs to be as detailed as possible, some people don't do that, and you can't control that. So it's a way of covering yourself, and it's a way of maintaining control.
Thank you.
You're
Please
welcome.
continue with the next question.
Sure.
Hey, Chris, you have a couple of other questions here.
Sure.
They've been building their bots without the use of Orchestrator yet. Will REFramework work in this instance?
Yes.
And
The only
then-
difference, yes, you'll have to store your assets in an asset page.
Okay.
Okay.
And
It would
then,
be the name and the asset. You would just put here, you'd have to maintain this page if you're not using Orchestrator.
okay, great. And then, REFramework uses queues, so would you need those for Orchestrator?
Same person?
No, it's a different person. You may want to look at the REFramework Lite if you are not using Orchestrator. I think Justin was trying to answer the last question. Yeah.
Okay.
And then Justin, you did a good job. Thank you. And is there a link to view all the session recordings? Yes, if you look at the chat, I put it like at the top, but I can add it again. So tomorrow, let me grab that link again, just to make sure everybody knows that this is recorded and will show up tomorrow. So it's the same link you used to get in today, but let me just add it so you guys can copy it and just go directly to it. Just give me a minute. So you'll find a copy of the presentation as well as the recording there tomorrow. You just go to the wrap up event page. It's a tab at the top of the page. And I think that was the last of the questions. Justin is laughing because he tried to help where he could, which is great.
Yeah, I like that.
That's what we like about the community. Good.
Okay, guys, I'm going to promote this because this will be new for me, apps. So I'm excited about this. We haven't used a lot of apps at Mary Kay, and so we're starting to get into this. So I know nothing really about apps. So I encourage you to go to these sessions because I will be there.
Yeah, and this is a pretty hot topic with UiPath right now. So I think a lot of people are just starting to learn about apps and get into it. So we have 2 of our MVPs promoting these and delivering these sessions. So that would be great.
Yeah, I know it's driven by Andy, he's a real start on our apps, So these will be really great sessions. I agree.
Yes. And somebody asked another question about, I'm just going to put another URL in the chat window. They wanted to know, like, can MVPs help them? And the answer is yes. If you go here to the Community Path website, what you'll see is under contributors, the contributor tab, there is a section called mentorship programs. So you can request a mentor. It can be a one-on-one or just put your name in there and what you're interested in being mentored on. And then somebody will be mapped with you. And it could just be one session where you just need to know a little bit more, or it could be a couple of sessions, you decide that with your mentor. But it's a really great program, and I really encourage you to do that if you just need a little extra help or want somebody who is talented or has a skill in a certain area. That's a great program.
And I do the mentors. I'm mentoring some people now also, so it is a good program.
And you can request Chris if you want to be mentored specifically in REFramework.
Yeah, don't ask me to mentor apps because you're going to be as lost as I am.
So, well, thank you, everybody. Do you have any additional questions for tonight?
No questions, but thanks, Chris, for very informative REFramework sessions.
No problem.
Well,
that's why we're here.
Thank you, Chris, again, for providing these sessions. They're great. And thank you all for coming. We really do appreciate you being part of our new developer community. So we do hope you'll join us at our apps, and who knows what comes after that. But if you do have any topics that you're really interested in learning about, I'm going to put my name in the chat, my email, and just send me a link and say, hey, we really want to learn about this or that. And we'll find somebody to provide us some sessions on it. Okay, so with that, I think we're gonna stop recording and thank you.
Thanks, Diane.